Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bernie Doherty, and I'm the Community Archaeologist for County Galway. The Galway Community Archaeology Project is funded by Galway County Council and the Heritage Council. So today we'd like to introduce you to archaeology and climate change. We have Michael Gibbons, is an independent archaeologist, and his recent research is focused on documenting the rich upland and coastal archaeology of Connemara. Fergal McNamara is a Grade 1 conservation architect and founding member of 7L Architects, and he's over 20 years experience working on historic buildings and places from the 5th to the 20th centuries. But first we're going to have Gordon Bromley. Gordon is a lecturer in physical geography and climate change at NUI Galway. He specialises in using glacial geology and geochemistry to reconstruct our natural history and the mechanics of past climatic upheaval. Information that can then be used to better understand the present climate and refine computer-based projections of the future. Currently, Gordon is leading investigations in Antarctica, the tropical Andes of Colombia and Peru, Ireland and Scotland, and is developing the Republic of Ireland's first cosmogenic nuclide facility at NUI Galway. So without further ado, I'm going to let Gordon take you away. All right, thanks, Gordon.
Well, thanks for that introduction, Bernie. It's some of that will sound a little convoluted. Antarctica, for example, and cosmogenic nuclides and things like that. It sounds a little space age, and we'll get to that in a moment. Now, I have 8 minutes basically to try and introduce the why and wherefore of climate change and how it pertains to well, to culture and archaeology, really. Now, very quickly, my background is actually in the two of them, and all my work in Peru has been a sort of a synergy between environmental reconstruction, that's what I do, and the sort of archaeologic explorations of the first Americans as they entered South America after the last ice age. So that's what my colleague Kurt Rademacher does. And so I've always been fascinated in this kind of synergy. Now, for the west of Ireland, thinking about climate, we really define this as simply average weather. And that's measured over a period of at least 30 years. So here we can define our climate generally as temperate maritime. And what this means on the ground is that all year round it's relatively mild. So that ocean that surrounds us is buffering our temperature. It prevents really extreme high temperatures and it prevents really extreme cold temperatures. We have ample rainfall, as we all know, and wind. So this doesn't mean that we don't experience those extremes. You know, we do have cold snaps, we have droughts, we have even hurricanes actually from time to time, but these are encompassed within that 30-year range of what's possible right here. So climate change, this is essentially a long-term shift in mean climate state that pushes us into an entirely new set of conditions. And it's these new conditions that might be considerably different from what our society and our civilization has come to expect. Now, Earth's climate, as you all know, has a long and tempestuous history. It ranges from what we call the Eocene hothouse, so that'd be about 50 million years ago, perhaps, when crocodiles may have inhabited the Arctic, to the Proterozoic Snowball Earth. Now, this is more like 700 million years ago, and you see that on the right there, but we're talking about all the land surface on this planet being in the grip of glaciers and the oceans being a sort of a slushy, icy mix there. And so the only certainty in life then on this planet is sort of death, taxes, and climate change. Now, I think this is exciting. You know, this is my job. And we all want to know more about the gory details of Earth's sordid past. And this is partly because change is fascinating to us. And it's also partly because this dynamic nature of this is what shaped our landscapes. You know, this is what provided the fabric on which our culture, our civilizations have developed since. So what we hear most about today is anthropogenic climate change and how modern global warming is being driven by our burning of fossil fuels for power, food, transport, and so on. And this combustion releases carbon dioxide as a byproduct, and that gas simply has the amazing ability to trap outgoing long-wave radiation. So it keeps it in the atmosphere instead of allowing it to pass back into space. In any given year, volcanoes pump out carbon dioxide and photosynthesizing plants take it up. This is in the ocean, it's on land. And that results in a sort of a quasi-equilibrium that we call the carbon cycle. Now, the generous species that we are, humans are pumping in an additional 40 billion tons or more of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That's every year. And so this balance is way off, and the natural carbon cycle has been tipped. It's been tipped over, basically. Our oceans and our atmosphere are warming up as a result, and we can measure that. You know, it's all observable. So this presents both challenges and, as I see it, opportunities, and that's both now and it's in the future. But it's the major uncertainty about modern global warming that tends to dominate headlines and cause sleepless nights, because our civilization is very much built on certainty and predictability. So that's today, that's when our hunter-gatherer ancestors moved into Ireland. We want to anticipate the seasons and the tides and the migrations and even the weather. So we now hear a lot of evidence suggesting that we're drifting out of the predictable and into the unknown. So I'm not going to tell you what the future holds for Ireland, because I don't know, and none of us does really, but two things are clear. As temperature warms, because of the CO2 that you can see rising in this graph on the screen there, that's just measured, as the temperature rises, ice on land is melting, and so sea level is rising. Okay, sea level rises 5 millimeters a year. Also, our temperature in Ireland is gradually creeping upwards. So there are clear ramifications for coastal environments and coastal heritage due to the former. Okay, sea level rise means enhanced erosion of soft coastlines. It means more frequent inundation during storms, damaging low-lying infrastructure and so on. But the impact of the latter, of the warming, is more uncertain because we don't yet know how our massive and our dynamic climate system actually responds to the sort of forcing that we're providing. So one logical way to figure this out ahead of time is to look back in time. And that's at previous periods when Earth's climate was changing. And we use the geologic record to do this and to establish how fast climate changes occur, why they occur, and how they impact the land upon which we depend. So by the geologic record, you see a small part of it here, I'm not talking just millions of years. I'm actually talking centuries to millennia. Okay, so for example, following the culmination of the last ice age here in Ireland, that's when anatomically modern humans were reclaiming landscapes that were previously buried by ice in the British Isles, in mainland Europe, and perhaps also here in Ireland. And so I'm going to give you now a very quick example about the sorts of records that show us how our climate system ticks. And Bernie, I'm relying on you to kick me off if I go over time here. So walking through the west of Ireland, many of you will be familiar with these sorts of boulders that litter our landscape. All right, and these were once explained as the playthings of mythical giants. We now know that they are glacial erratics, and these were quarried out of the mountains by ice, and they were dumped on the landscape when these giant glaciers melted back and disappeared. Broadly, we can all see that this occurred at the end of the last ice age. That makes sense. But thanks to geochemistry and this rather fantastical sounding cosmogenic nuclide surface exposure dating, which is one hell of a mouthful, geologists like me, we can now say exactly when this happened. And that's actually opened a whole can of worms for us in terms of climate science. So how is this done? My research group has visited various sites in and around Connemara and the Burren, where glacial erratics sit upon the bedrock, like these that you see in the pictures here. So these are sites there: Moycullen, Inishmore, Marm Cross, the summit of Shanawana, and the slopes and the plateau of the Burren. And this work really takes us all over the place. And at each site, we're seeking granite and other quartz-bearing boulders that originated in the Connemara highlands and were dragged to their resting places by the ice sheet. And we chisel little pieces off. That's one of my students doing this same work in Antarctica. Off these boulders, we crush it into sand, and then essentially we dissolve it in hot, concentrated hydrofluoric acid. And what we're trying to do here is isolate a rare isotope called beryllium-10 that only accumulates in these rock surfaces, in these boulders, in the quartz, when that rock is exposed to cosmic radiation that is constantly bombarding our planet. That's from outer space. So we have to rewind just a moment. When a rock is inside the mountain or is buried by ice, it's shielded from this radiation. So it's only when the rock is dumped by the melting ice sheet, say in Connemara, that it's exposed to the cosmic radiation and the accumulation of this beryllium-10 nuclide begins. So if we can measure that concentration of the nuclide in the erratics, we know the rate at which it's produced. We can actually calculate how long ago the boulders were dumped on the landscape and therefore when climate was changing. At a point, you have to just take my word for that, but it works. And in our part of the world, we can now say that these glacial erratics in Connemara and the Burren were deposited approximately 17,500 years ago. So here you see our different sites, and on the left you see what the data look like. And that tells us that the last Irish ice sheet melted at that time. And because ice responds to air temperature in a very direct and straightforward way, we can say that summers must have been warming up at that time and becoming too warm for ice to survive. Now, I'm wrapping up here. Not only is this date of 17,500 years ago quite a lot earlier than the traditional view of when the Ice Age ended here, so almost 7 millennia before the onset of the Holocene interglacial, the fact that all parts of our study area here, be they offshore, inland, highland, lowland, they became ice-free at the same time, demonstrates to us that this warming event was rapid. And the more we do this sort of work, both in Ireland and abroad, the more obvious it is becoming that when Earth's climate changes, it does so in abrupt jumps and not in gradual shifts. So this last point is something I think that we as a society would do well to ponder. The long-term record of past climate change suggests that future changes coming now are going to be swift. Okay. So on that happy note, I will stop yapping on about climate change and let the archaeology take over.
Gordon, thanks so much. That was brilliant, fascinating. Okay, now we're going to bring you to Michael Gibbons. He's an independent archaeologist and member of the Institute of Archaeologists of Ireland. His specialist interest is in the maritime and pilgrimage landscapes throughout Ireland. Recent research publications include articles on Skellig Michael and Newgrange. Ongoing research is focused on documenting the rich upland and coastal archaeology of Connemara.
Good morning, everyone. Michael Gibbons. I'm an archaeologist. I've worked on the coast of Connemara and the wider west of Ireland for the guts of 40 years now. So my brief talk is going to give us a sort of insight into the uplands, and this is a classic view of Connemara from Nettlemore, looking north over Coon, Kilkieran, onto Crockmardon and the mountains of central Connemara, the Mam Turks, and the snow-capped here. So far Talavus Thraw, people of the land and the sea, a complete interaction between these landscapes here, and of course a whole lakeland environment as well. So it's and that landscape has been settled for definite for the last 7,000 or 8,000 years. This is a distribution map of some of the main coastal features, which are the ones that are most immediately obviously being impacted by storm surges and what is perceived as anyways an increased weather volatility. So some of our oldest sites, Fanor down here from around 7,000 years ago. We have a recent date from near Cushariga, near Minna from around 8,000 years ago also, and on the Rindvale coast, a late Mesolithic hunter-gatherer landscape. We have one artifact, however, from Aran Islands that was found by a man called Brendan Murphy and published in the Royal Irish Academy in the 70s, and that's an Achillean hand axe from 300,000 years ago. And that's a really important artifact, long considered suspect because it was a British plot to further complicate our already complex history, but it's now coming into its own because we have identified 4 or 5 other Paleolithic artifacts from Ireland in the immediate period. The first by Frank Mitchell, more recently in County Down and in Waterford Harbour. So we may have a Paleolithic in all of this, the old Stone Age, pre-10,000 years ago. But for now, our evidence in Connemara, with the exception of this really important iron find, is from the Mesolithic, begins our first early period. And the evidence of these early sites, you find them in particularly after big storm surges. And some of our particular landscapes, our Macar Dune landscapes, are very vulnerable. This is after the last big storm in 2014. It's like a knife was taken to the dune systems. And you can see in the section here, it looks like a barrow. We actually have a date from this from the Iron Age. Underneath all this 5 meters of sand, there's a whole other layer of early, probably Neolithic and Bronze Age material. So these dune systems from Inishturbet in the west to Canton and Nillon in the south, Renville in the north, they're revealing a whole series of different type of sites, individual monuments. And here in the case, you have a layer of dog whelk, really important artifact used to extract a snail to extract a purple dye. But here you have slumping of this section, and the whole section slumped together in situ. So these dune systems can be particularly difficult to actually, because they're mobile, so you have to be really careful excavating them, but they are incredibly interesting sites and very fragile. This is a dog whelk midden, out of context, but in a consolidated layer here. So these are first described, some of these midden sites in the 19th century after a storm by George Petrie describes a 100-foot mound of sand being blown away and a Scarab Ray type village being found at Dogs Bay. This is a Mesolithic site on the Renville coast, recently dated here. And further on, following the big storms, a growing awareness among local people. This is to Elizabeth Moylan and her niece Lorna, who found this is a rough out mudstone axe and a polished stone axe of the same stone. This stone axe came from Fenor, from an axe factory there, and they're traded during the Mesolithic around Galway Bay, out to Arran, into Connemara, and in this really amazing cycle. So these were found by 2 local women, and subsequent to this, we have found others on field work here. So local people have a huge contribution to make. This is a whole lost landscape. The Mesolithic is one area we know very little about. And of course, we also have ecofacts. This is a deer tinny from near Cleggan, and again, a low spring tide after a storm. The Durling stones have been moved off, and you have an intact carcass of probably red deer here. In the uplands, similarly, this is near Up the Rard. You have a hilltop tomb, the largest tomb, intact tomb in Connemara, dominating Cairn Seafin. But the tomb is surrounded by blanket bog. But as you can see, the blanket bog is in bad shape here. It's eroding. High-level blanket bog erosion is taking place throughout the uplands, and that's posing both opportunities and challenges. Forestry is impacting on it, triggering bog flows, for example. And the warming is actually having, in fact, there's a high-level erosion. It's been going on here for at least a century. And you can see that when you look at the various aerial photographs of the time. This is another tomb here. The next one I'll show you is a court tomb. All the bogs are cut away. So a lot of the coastal bogs, we've lost them, not to climate change, but to high populations in the 18th and 19th century. So the turf trade and the kelp industry had a huge impact environmentally. The drying out of the uplands now and in the wetter weather we're getting, is leading to quite large scale erosion, opening up opportunities to study upland settlement, which we otherwise wouldn't see. So in the uplands, we have lots of issues with just the eroding blanket bogs that carpet much of our uplands still. The coastal ones have long been cut away for fuel. But in this photograph, you can see the drowned coastal landscapes here of Canton and Nillon, north of Arran. Arran as a bigger area, probably in the early Holocene, 7,000-8,000 years ago. And when you look closely in some environments, this is our only, well, it's one of 2 or 3. It's a Neolithic tomb, possible passage tomb, though I think it's a core tomb, down on the Cork coast where I've done some field work. It's a little, maybe core tomb or small passage tomb, and it's very nice evidence of sea level rise. This is Maeve here next to the tomb. It's a lovely little chamber, seaweed only visible on a low tide, low spring tide preferably. So it's a really nice evidence of solid. And similar sites to this, you'll see it in Gaverness in the western, southwest Brittany. Other sites then we're not too sure. This is near Carna, again, low spring tide. We've mapped lots of areas from sort of from Loop Head up to Ackle Head. And in sheltered areas, place where there's fossil to fall on, where there's shelter to be had. This is a rectangular building, very like a Neolithic house. It's undated. A lot of our features are undated, but there's a lot of features out there. Connemara in particular, with its 50 islands and sheltered bays, has a huge array of unmapped archaeology. So this is one of the sites here. And then you can see Cleggan Head, other monuments coming into the picture now in terms of erosion. Higher surges actually coming close to them. This is the famous Cleggan Farm core tomb here. And then we have, of course, some landscapes that have been revealed because of overpopulation. So some of the issues related to climate or global warming are actually associated with overpopulation, triggering ecological downstream effects. This is a Bronze Age landscape, which you mapped on the Galway survey when I worked for the OPW many years ago. On the west end of Inishark, an entire landscape still intact. Visible now that all the bogs have been cut away. So denuded by a large population, but revealing a Bronze Age landscape of exceptional quality, dating to around 1500 BC. And then on the Galway coast, as we know, there's a Barna boat from Barna, which is a Neolithic boat around 4000 BC log boat. And this is a trackway which Shauna Cushla from Winchurst and myself located a number of years ago. And it dates from around 1700 BC. This is on the low spring tide. So very, very suggesting sea level rise of the order of 3 to 4 meters perhaps on Galway Bay since the Bronze Age. And of course, our Bronze Age sites, we have many of them. This is one here in the Uplands. We have upland ritual monuments here, a Gobamachas and Purtach, so peeping out of the bog with a Cayman Kittle, this hollow beside it. But in the peatlands around this, we've more recently found another stone row in a eroding blanket bog, 3 in this little valley here. This is Glenina. So what on first look at it, the valleys are very low in terms of monuments. When you go in there and doing field work, certain valleys have lots of material in them, while others appear to have very little. So there's a monumental dimension to our Bronze Age. One of the issues we have, of course, here with rainfall, the higher rainfall that we may be getting are bog flows, bog avalanches. This is a recent one from the National Park. There's been a series of massive avalanches here. This one is actually coming right down on the late medieval road, a road that's first recorded in 1812. And this is opposite Connemara. You can see the bog flow coming down. And these are becoming, certainly in the bends, there's quite a number of big ones in the last year or two, following periods of dry weather backed by intensive rainfall. So the bog shrinking back, then bog bursts, and this is spilling down the hillside, taking everything before it. But these have been going on. You can see on the mountainside where you've had bog flows. And of course, the ongoing issue is high-level turf cutting. As the turf cutting is moving higher up the ridges, this is triggering bog avalanches. And we'll see, there was a famous one near Caja Fields a number of years ago, which you can still see the evidence of. So our uplands are going to be impacted very severely because these events are going to become the drying, and then intense wetting are going to be triggering more events, which will impact on our natural landscapes. And of course, we have the evidence from the Neolithic and Bronze Age farming that went on in these uplands. So we have, as Thomas Aquinas said about the landscape, the only permanent thing is change. It's just the pace of change that we're uncomfortable with. We may not be able to adapt quick enough to it. And you can see on the shore at Trawar and Inishmore, we've identified, this is one from the 19th century, a field system in the intertidal zone. A really nice example. It runs under the dune systems, up onto the hill, but also out into the water. And because it's a sheltered environment, it still survives. I've identified a similar landscape to this on Lidocaine North. Excuse me. And with the erosion, we're also finding a number of artifacts. All these 3 artifacts here were found following storm surges. This is a Hiberno Norse ring pin from Omey, an Iron Age pin here from Trusca Middens in the southwest. Again, an encircled Latin cross eroding out of Omey Island. So individual communities have a big chance to actually help the National Monument Service in mapping some of these. And on Sunday, this Sunday, I got a phone call from Inishlacken reporting a burial on the islands there, which I've reported to Garage Conroy, who's our local archaeologist here for the OPW. So there's a lot more attention to the coast now, thankfully, and so we're picking up features on the coast that people wouldn't perhaps have been aware of before. So drowned landscapes, people are now beginning to become conscious of them. This is a beautiful image of Fargo Mcnamara's day on the pilgrimage day. But again, in the storm surges, just on the shore here, a whole cemetery was exposed and unfortunately destroyed very shortly afterwards. And I asked an old man here, when was the last burials on the island? Oh, he said, when the French passed by. No, the French passed by here in 1798. So it's quite a while. So we have, and you can see the other issue with high rainfall followed by drought conditions is we're getting big impacts on lake dwellings. This is Dulitzer. It's near Carna. It's a lake dwelling subject to storm and wave fetch. The waves sluicing out the internal deposits, just leaving the outer ring. So it's an area we don't think about lakes and climate change, but they are going to have a major impact. The growth of bogs created a lot of the lakes in the first place, but more dynamic river and lake systems will also impact on our richest archaeological monuments, which are in fact our lake dwellings, just in terms of artifacts. The coast, was Menlo Castle. This is what's left of it. It's at the end of the line as you fly out to Inishmore. And this was a burgh castle, and it's literally the sea that was taking it away. So we have a big issue with resources, or lack of resources, and we're finding stuff. We yet have to have the resources to match it, but we are mapping them. At least we have a good database now from around the country. This is a star-shaped fort on Inishbofin, but just east of it was a harbour which I identified on the Galway Archaeological Survey many years ago. But the storm surges have turned up a whole deserted harbour edge settlement just inside this beautiful little harbour here, probably 17th century. That harbour village, unfortunately, was destroyed by the next storm. So, we're losing a lot of material, and we don't yet have the resources really we don't have a a rescue fund or a unit yet. Hopefully we might get one. And this is part of a harbour which I found on Killaney during the Galway survey. It's a late medieval harbour, and this harbour, of course, was carved out by an angel with a flaming sword in order to allow the saints to arrive into this cliff-bound island. So in places you have a lovely combination of myth and legend intermingling with some of the archaeology, and lots of folklore, of course, associated with some monuments here. We have stone boats in Connemara, subsea roads, Bourne and Eve, a whole sort of magical subsea landscape overlaying with the actual landscape. So, and then we have a specific sort of response to, in the late Marcus Casey, we flew the coast, all along the coast, mapping promontory forts. Well, one of the sites we mapped was here at Lidocaine. It's a lovely place in the islands in County Nilal, and it looked like a snake. And it was years later before I actually was able to locate it. And what it turns out to be is a causeway. So we have a network of causeways across the islands, and I've mapped quite a few of these, or at least listed them. And this is an exceptionally rich landscape. We have hundreds and hundreds of unmapped built features, mostly from the 18th century. But this is a stone causeway making Lidocaine and Inishbofin at least connected at a half tide or full tide. So we have these links, and causeways, of course, to islands are nothing new. The oldest one we have, of course, is from Loch Cara from 1100 BC, a massive oak causeway. Other sites, the use of power and these waves. This is a lovely site down again in the islands. It's a tie. I first saw it, I thought it was a mill. In fact, it turned out to be a fish trap for Stiphanines, a sand smelt, a fish that fed half of Britain in the 19th century. It's like an anchovy or small herring, and they're fished in this little canalized stream using adaptability is a big feature. This is a bicycle wheel with the spokes taken out using some discarded fish farm netting, and the stones in the stream are whitewashed and the stream itself is canalized. So this is a hunter-gatherer way of life hidden in plain sight. Two sites I've known that are still fished on the Connemara coast. Fishing a fish that are completely unknown here, a sand smelt. So, and of course, the landscape here is peopled, the later landscapes here. This is just a classic image of Connemara. If you want an image of Connemara, The dog's sons off the sea, as it translates, is a fishing, farming community interacting with that coastal landscape and island landscape. So you have your little, your low choke here, second boat here, your harbour built here, and then a clearing through the granite boulder shore running out for over 100 meters. So the populations of these coasts have been interacting with nature and dealing with climate change for the last at least 10,000 years, with the possibility of a Paleolithic presence out there, first identified by Brendan Murphy when he visited Dún Aengus as a student coming from Britain, but he's from Louth. So the hunt from the Paleolithic is also on in terms of our interaction with these coastal and climatic change. So, Gormil, sorry, it's a quick run through upland and coastal archaeology, but it's an exceptionally rich landscape. Most of it yet unmapped, but we're getting a sort of a hint of just the wealth that's out there. So thank you very much, Bernie, for the invitation.
You're very welcome, Gormila Mayagat Mihal. So thanks so much. I'm sure there'll be a few questions afterwards. So next up we have Fergal McNamara. He's a conservation architect and founded 7L Architects in 2018. He's over 20 years experience working on historic buildings and places dating from the 5th to the 20th century. Projects range from sensitive repair of ruins to city-scale public realm strategies. Current projects include the conservation of 3 castles in Galway, Dublin City Graveyard Strategy, Connolly Station Headquarters, a heritage centre for the High Cross at Clonus, and he's recently completed public realm and conservation works to Carlingford Castle. Fergal, thanks so much for joining us, and I'll let you take over.
Thanks very much, Bernie, and thanks for asking me to talk today. I'm taking it right back to more recent considerations and more practical, I suppose, in terms of medieval buildings, essentially, and just their conservation and maintenance and how it relates to climate change to a degree, but we'll just kind of how, I suppose, just to deal with, I suppose, agents of decay and how climate change can be considered to change the rates of these decay. So just in respect to stone ruins, we're talking here about medieval churches and tower houses that, you know, that Galway is particularly rich in. And what I suppose the main agents of decay, the first and foremost would be neglect, in the sense that these buildings have been abandoned through, you know, other agents of change relating to political or, you know, changes in technologies, and then, you know, all sorts of, you know, societal change. And then, but they're, you know, one of the, you know, a great resource for our cultural understanding of the past, that I'm not really going to deal with now, and they're interesting kind of conversations to have. But I'm just talking specifically here today about vegetation encroachment, which, you know, would be related to climate and weather events, in the sense of that these, you know, stone monuments have, you know, survived for, you know, and in these cases up to 1,000 years when we're talking medieval buildings of these sorts. But the I suppose the pressures on their conservation continue, but that vegetation encroachment is something that we can actually address, whereas climate and weather events are something that are beyond our control, and it just requires monitoring. And vandalism is another one that, you know, occurs unfortunately regularly, and something that we just have to deal with when the time comes. So as we're, you know, we were discussing earlier about weather events are one aspect of climate change, and then there's just the incremental changes to humidity and temperature across the seasons are also considerations. But again, these happen in ways that, you know, in terms of weather events, we can't really predict. And in terms of the changes, there, you know, obviously larger concerns there in terms of how climate change is managed. But what we do know is that these buildings have survived, you know, smaller, you know, large amount of weather events, but also changes to climate over the period of time that they've existed. Also, this is not to say that, we're talking specifically, I suppose, about ivy encroachment for this talk, but that's not to say that ivy and ruins have this, a lovely relationship, and it's something that people really value when they look at a ruin in terms of the picturesque qualities of, I suppose, the ecological richness that these ruins have, and also their, the built heritage value. And we're always trying to kind of strike a reasonable balance between the two. But there's no doubt that, this is an example here. This is Lidocaine Tower House that we looked at last year under the Community Monuments Fund. We produced a conservation management plan. And one of the main delights of the Tower House is coming to the very top, and you enter this beautiful, like it's like a garden, like a sky garden, where the ivy has encroached to such a degree here that you can't see the wall tops. But so it's a lovely place to experience and to enjoy. But you're also concerned because you know that the ivy, if it's allowed to continue in this stage, will slowly crumble away more of what all the damage that's done to date. So ivy and trees, the benefits are just simply, what they provide in terms of biodiversity. They also help to shelter the walls from those extremes of humidity and temperature. But they can also cause situation, and then obviously their appearance. People enjoy the appearance of ruins that are ivy covered, and they can find a newly conserved structure a bit stark without that kind of the two going together. This is just two projects. This is another project, sorry, that was we did some work on in relation to the CMF grant. This is Abbey Gormachan, which is an abbey church ruin in East Galway that had been almost completely covered in ivy. At this stage, the ivy has been trimmed back to expose, so we can see more of the stonework and actually try to assess the impacts that the ivy is having. But you can't really assess it without trimming it back, and we'll go through the kind of the steps towards that. And then just you can see in the background another area that was covered in ivy being conserved at that time. And this was done with John Britton, consulting engineer, and then also Matteo Mitchell were the masons, and the Moore group were providing archaeology. And in this case, this is an example where there's kind of two types here, where there's a kind of a relatively benign ivy coverage here, where the ivy had been rooting in the ground, so it could be cut off short and just simply peeled away from the stonework without much damage. But in the background here, where we have the transept chapel, we had to leave a lot of the ivy in place because it had encroached so much into the stonework that it had become this matrix of roots and stone. And we had to tread very carefully there in terms of the removal. And this is just some photographs showing, the different stages of ivy displacing basically the mortars, taking their place and creating this kind of jumble of stone and roots and leaves, which, takes a kind of a delicate touch to get to the bottom of trying to bring it back to a solid base. So if we hadn't intervened here over time, basically this gable here would have been very vulnerable to further encroachment of the ivy, losing more stone, but over time also creating kind of a wind sail effect, where the mass of the buildings increased by the thick growth of ivy, and causes the already vulnerable structure to be more at risk of collapse. So again, ivies and trees here, the threats about structural damage by roots and branches. Then there's impact damage, wind loading, and increased weathering. Impact damage, I mean, in terms of trees, fallen boughs, or even falling trees, is something that we have to address from time to time. And it's not as good when you're doing it in terms of an emergency situation where a tree that you're always been concerned about suddenly does actually fall in a big wind, and then you're trying to pick up the pieces, where a kind of a more proactive management can kind of address these things as time goes by and identifies areas of vulnerability. I suppose the conservation first steps for people who are, I suppose, in charge or interested in constructors in their locality, especially under the the CMF grant, where this funding is available now for communities to conserve their monuments, is first of all we have to consider safety first of all, and that's safety of the public, safety of the ecology as well, in terms of the animals that might live there, but also after safety, and then and of course the people who might come to fix it too, is we have to make sure that we record its condition before we intervene, and importantly also to obtain specialist advice on how best to proceed, because there's lots of variables and things to consider before we get started. Like a team might include, and not everyone here needs to be involved, but that there'll be a conservation specialist, of like an architect or an engineer who had kind of the practical knowledge of how to repair buildings, an archaeologist there to record its condition prior to the work, during the work, and afterwards, an ecologist also to assess it as a habitat, a mason to be there to unpick it safely, and a landscaper can be useful in terms of giving things a trim and treating the ivy. But it's important that you have a combination of these as required to do it safely. And I'll give you some case studies here later just to kind of go through that. The next steps would be the specialist would kind of assess the risks posed by the vegetation. So there's a distinction between ivy that's really just sitting on the surface with little small rootlets that are just, they actually can have lots of benign effects on the structure, and beneficial ones too. So in that case, you would not intervene in that case, and you'd kind of keep it in its way. But where ivy's rooting into the wall can be very, very destructive. And that's when issues of structural integrity of the ruin and the ecological value of the habitat need to be considered, and a balance struck. And then areas of concern need to be made safe, first of all, with fencing and warning signage. And then there's a stage of approvals with notification to the National Monument Service, or ministerial consent, as the case can be. I suppose licensing, derogation license from the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and then a vegetation clearance as well is only permitted outside of the nesting seasons generally, except in extreme cases where there's a real structural concern of people's safety, and that's somewhere where you'd still want to be agreeing that with the National Parks and Wildlife Service. And then in terms of vegetation treatment, there's a lot of I'll show you some research towards the end there, but like the first of all is safety assessment, in terms of also not just by the public, but how to get access and how to get vehicles to site, or hoists as the case may be. And then what we always suggest to do first, if you really need to look more closely at the structure, if it's very, very thick, that they be given a haircut first, which is really just a hard trim back against the surface, so you can investigate structural damage. But there's always needs to be a kind of a sense that you can't see everything, so there is an element of kind of trust and process in relation to removing the ivy. And what often works well is to spray it in full leaf and to allow it to die it off and shrivel. But that needs to be done in a managed process as well, where you're not just spraying it off 1 year and deciding to come back in year 2. You need to be able to kind of, that's really only for a matter of weeks prior to starting work with the mason on site to actually sort it out. Because what happens when the ivy is treated, it tends to shrivel and shrink, and that destabilizes the wall further. So it can cause, uncontrolled collapse and just loss of stone and context. And then a careful removal from the wall surface can sometimes work, where it's really just a matter of peeling it off the surface. But in that case, usually if it's that easy, it's probably benign anyway. So it does involve a mason on site pulling out roots, trying to keep the stone in place. And if the stone has to come down, if it's not stable, that it's put aside in a way that's, you know, recorded, and so that allow it to be put back up as part of the process of rebedding. So removal of embedded roots should only be undertaken with the attendance of and the recording of the archaeologist or the conservation specialist. Temporary supports might also be required, and they would often be independent of a scaffold, so that you can have safe access while also keeping the structure in place. And then thick or inaccessible roots should be tapped with root killers such as eco plugs, and then left in place. There's another ways of doing it just with copper tubing and you know, creating a kind of reservoir of root killer, and that's something that you might have to attend to it after a period of time, because that takes a long time to work through the system, and so it might be a multi-phase approach that you need to take. And that's important that walls are not left in an unstable state without proper precautions put in place. And that's something that's consideration at Abbey Gormickan, for instance, where we didn't have funding to finish out the project as we might have liked. So we had to make sure that it was left in a state that while we're fundraising for the next phase, that it wouldn't be unstable and cause that people would be aware of the issues. So just in terms of repair and consolidation, the next stage when the ivy is removed is to do with proper recording of the stonework, and analysis is very important, and that the projects in our experience that are guided by conservation management plans tend to attract funding and approval. So it is important to get a team in place to kind of, I suppose, come up with a plan and a strategy for this, the building, before putting the works in place. But sometimes you do have to act in a kind of an emergency situation, and that's where you need advice also. And then experienced masons using of lime mortar and best practice techniques in stone repair in accordance with an improved methodology. And this is just an example. This one is a medieval church in Clontarf in the graveyard there. So just as a kind of a practical example of I suppose local groups, you know, trying to, you know, tidy up their locality, but I suppose creating a situation and that's, you know, it wasn't as well managed as it might have been. And in this case, this was before we were doing work in the graveyard in another context, and happened to have a photograph how it was. This is sort of like a winter shrub and sprayed. And what happened was that the local community started to come and pull at it in a managed way, and you can see the results, which, you know, caused could have been it was luckily that no one was there present at the time to be injured. The sort of thing that they had done and left, and then over the weekend it had fallen apart. So that's, you know, a large enough project to address. And this is you know, again, it's just the kind of the merge situation of just kind of getting an engineer involved to, you know, devise a kind of a practical way of propping and shuttering it, so that we were ready for, you know, got some fundraising in place from the Community Management Fund to address it this year. So that's pretty much as it is at the moment. And this is another example, and this is Menlo Castle outside Galway City. You know, a lot of people will be familiar with this this ruin. And just at the moment we're working on the three castles outside the city, Menlo to a lesser degree, but also Tyrrell and or Terryland Castle and Merlin Castle. But it was interesting, we made our first visit in June, and by September, when we return visit, someone had come and tapped the roots here with root killer, and it caused, you know, all this to die off on the facade facing the river. But our concerns there is we don't have scope or plans to address the condition of the parapets. So it was all very instructive in terms of we could see the walls, but we you know, we have concerns now about leaving it in that condition, with now the ivy killed off and you know, the corbels and the parapets all left exposed in that case after being covered in ivy. And this is Lidocaine Castle again. So that was our sky garden at the beginning of the talk. And this is another example where I suppose someone had taken it to cut off the roots of the ivy at the base. And what happens here is that it tends not to kill off, often does not kill off the ivy, even if it's rooting in the ground. And what tends to happen is adventitious roots in the ivy start to make their way into the walls and start to feed off the joints between the stone for moisture and minerals, and it can actually create a larger problem than it would have been otherwise. And this just to finish up, just some useful guides that are quite accessible. And this one is the advice series from the Department of Heritage on ruins and the conservation repair of mason ruins. And then this is an interesting report from English Heritage that goes through a number of case studies where it's kind of unsuccessful in the sense that they were trying to recreate in a kind of controlled conditions effects from different type of ivy growth, but the ivy didn't really play ball in terms of, it wasn't, you know, it didn't you know, encroach enough on the walls and things like that to be useful. But it does give a kind of a good overview of what the best methods are for treating ivy. So that's really it.
Thanks so much, Fergal. That's brilliant. That was a great overview now of all the work you've been doing. You've been really busy. Thanks very much to all our speakers. I'm just going to give a quick overview now. Basically, what can we, the public, do? So we can record what we see, record what you see, record the changes in buildings, in the sites, in the coastlands. Look out for loose or fallen stones. Look out for vegetation getting too top heavy. If there is a project local to you, be aware that you do need permissions from the owners and from the National Monument Service if it is a recorded monument. As well, we need to get our conservation professionals as well. There are, as Fergal mentioned, there are the Community Monuments Fund has been available the last 2 years, and they look favourably on local projects that benefit the public. As well, the Heritage Council has given funding. This is Balnakill Church outside Glinsk in North Galway, and they've recently got funding for a conservation management plan. And as well, there will be the opportunity for groups to adopt a monument, and that will be coming up in the next month or so. So to look out for changes along our shorelines. So look out for finds that are washed up on beaches and lake shores as well. We want to look out for newly exposed sites, the erosion of known sites, and typically along the shoreline, there'll be middens, there might be graves exposed, you might find fish traps, etc. As well, be aware that there are shipwrecks on the seabed, and the weather, you know, obviously wave action is going to affect those as well. So if you're not sure, my email address is there and my phone number. Please do take a picture and take note of the location, but do not dig or excavate, please, because there could be associated archaeological features at the site. Within our wetlands, Mick gave a great overview there of how the bogs have been impacted, especially our raised bogs. So within our bogs, there are wooden platforms and trackways, and we also have crannogs within our wetlands as well as our lakes. So with the rise and fall of the water, you know, these are all being impacted. Within our bogs, typical finds might be bog butter, wooden vessels, leather shoes, you have your bog bodies, and book shrines. As well, metal artifacts like swords and knives are preserved really well within our bogs. But of course, because there is less peat, there's less soakage, there's less water, and hence the preservation within our bogs isn't going to be as good as it used to be. This is the Moyarwoods in Moyarwood, close to Woodlawn. There was the spearhead was found during turf cutting back in the 40s. It's down in the corner. As well, as Fergal had pointed out, the Community Monuments Fund was distributed by the National Monument Service in the last 2 years. We've been very lucky here in Galway, and we're very thankful to the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage for that funding. They do look favourably on sites that, you know, we're going to try and, I suppose, mitigate against climate change, and, you know, help in the preservation of sites that, and as well, they like to see sites that are, you know, places and projects that are beneficial to the public. The top left, this is an ombre that is located in Kilbocht outside Kilreekle. And the next picture is the Bardic School at Kilclooney in Milltown. On the right, there's the doorway, which was just recently, it was recently looked at, and we will be looking, doing a community conservation management plan there. And that is on the top right of your picture is Kilbocht again. And you can see there, you know, all there are so many buildings, and you can see where the stones have fallen, whatever. So again, as I say, just take a record, and because so we can actually assess the speed at which the climate change is affecting our buildings. On the bottom left there is Lidocaine Castle, and that's a picture of Lorick there. He's one of our specialist masons that we've worked closely with on different projects throughout the county. So just to be aware that we do need specialists to work on these projects. For the Built and Archaeological Heritage Climate Change Sectoral Adaptation Plan was prepared by Kathy Daly, and that's available on our website if you want to have a look at that. So on our website, you can look up Galway Community Archaeology. I'm also on Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. Feel free to give me a call, send me an email, or contact any archaeologist if you do come across anything in your area. So I'd like to thank you for listening. Thanks to all our guest speakers. Thank you to Marie Mannion, the Heritage Officer with Galway County Council, who supported this. Gordon, you mentioned in your talk how the warming event was rapid, was very rapid, and you expect that the changes we're seeing now are going to be rapid again as well. Like you know, is that like, would you advise us to work quickly in recording our archaeology and trying to mitigate against climate measure?
Definitely. It's very much like having a sort of a medical history. You know, you look at going forward, we need to know what the climate's capable of, and so we look back. And yes, the better the resolution our records become, and the better the technology becomes, the faster this warming seems to happen. And what I'm looking at in our records is natural warming, right? And we still try to figure out what exactly causes this. We have some ideas, but if it can do it that quickly on its own, then we dump so much CO2 into the atmosphere every year, which it's unprecedented. It's never been this rapid greenhouse forcing. Then yeah, there's no reason why we should not expect it to be equally swift, if not faster. No reason at all. So, you know, you can never be over prepared. Even if something didn't transpire, it's great to be prepared for that. And I would lose no time at all in documenting everything and anything that comes up.
Thanks very much, Gordon. And Michael, you've been really busy out in Connemara documenting our coastal archaeology. I suppose if we need to, build a good team and we really do depend on the public to highlight all the, you know, any finds that they do see or any changes. So I suppose what I'd like to, you know, everybody has a phone in their pocket these days. So, you know, any changes at all, like if they take a picture today, 5 years down the road, you know, that, you know, if they have it saved, they'll be able to look at that change again. So, you know, would you advise people to contact you or myself?
Thanks to the college being so close, you know, there's a lot of people who have done archaeology that mightn't actually be working in archaeology. There's lots of people in boats, very highly experienced hill farmers. So there's a lot of highly educated people out there in between fishermen and hill farmers and this, that, and the other. And there is a growing awareness that odd things, it's okay to report them, you know, to other people who are interested in it. So that's been very successful. Like the Mesolithic material that's turned up in Connemara, that's turned up on the shore from storm surges, was once underwater. It's been pushed ashore. So we're field walking the shore for drowned landscapes that are close by, but we can't get access to them yet. So we found some really interesting from Cantananilon, a drowned landscape with drowned forests, with stone axes, in Coombe along the Carno coast. The Mylands are turning up a whole array of really interesting material. Similarly, drowned material coming up from lobster pots attached to them with coralioch seaweeds attached off the Rainville Peninsula. And it's all to do with a consciousness locally that if they report them, someone will get back to them, that they're acknowledged for what they're doing. And often just, you know, a note in the local paper or on the local radio, it's very simple things that you can open up a lot of. There's a lot of people and of course every now and again it's a rock you're looking at that's natural, but that's fine as well. And so there's a great chance, because you know there's a lot of local archaeologists and historians out there, and because of TG Carr in particular and lots of other programs, and the work of Marie over the years, and now yourself, Winters in South Connemara, there's much bigger awareness now of our heritage. When I went to university, I was told there was nothing of archaeological interest in Connemara, you know, and that was 45 years ago. Such was the sort of negative perception that the dregs of Ireland were driven in by Cromwell's men. And that was that kind of common stereotype. And all that's changed now. So it's a very exciting time, and lots of really nice research going on by UCG and other Notre Dame University. So it's a very exciting time to be in the field and in the water and under the water. So you know, just at the weekend, a woman from Inishlacken rang me about a burial turning up on the Midden sites there, which I reported to. You know, we were looking at Garage Conraid, archaeologists with the OPW, National Monument Service in Galway. So we have a lot of intellectual assets to tap into, which is really, really useful, and a friendly environment to be swimming around in. So that's hugely important for science.
Yeah, it would be great to see the Cherish project on the southeast coast is fantastic. It'd be great to see something like that here. You know, you could have how many people working full time here in Galway.
They got the jump on us last time round. Hopefully not next time. You know, and they're doing fabulous work. You know, but there's a huge array of material here. There's at least 500 unmapped keys on the Connemara coast alone, just vernacular buildings on the shore, all being impacted. None of them being mapped really in any detail. So we've lots of training opportunities as well for young scholars, and you know, so it's an exciting future. When all we need is a few pound additional money. It's not, you know, survey in particular is very inexpensive compared to excavation. So we've a great chance to map material if we get any little bit of seed funding at all.
Yeah, as you said, like there's a lot of challenges out there because of climate change, but there's also a lot of opportunities. So like, because with archaeology, you end up, it's usually within rescue or you know, pre-development when we get to, you know, spend the money on it. But you know, there's a lot of information out there that needs to be gathered. So Fergal, you'd give a great insight there into the ivy and the encroachment, and you know, it just, like I've seen it firsthand, like on some of the projects that you've worked on here in Galway, and you know, it really is, it has to be assessed on a, like there really is no one solution for all. So it does have to be assessed by conservation architect or a structural engineer and an ecologist, basically.
Yeah, I mean, there's one opportunity to do it right, I think. And we always go from a position of trying to do as little as possible. That's but as much as is necessary. So that's the kind of the consideration to take at the very outset. So also being aware of budgets, you know, a lot of the time it's better not to intervene than start a job and not finish it, because inevitably you come to sites where there was best of intentions and there were 5 or 10 years before they got back there, and they've left the structure exposed, more exposed than it would have been. So there's always a balance to be struck there, and that it's great that there's the opportunity with the funding that's available now. There wasn't here 3 years ago, to start to kind of tackle these issues in these very wonderful sites that we have.
Yeah, because people with all best intentions of the world, you know, they think, oh, we'll do this, we'll give this a haircut ourselves, or we'll cut the roots here. They don't realize that they could be causing more destruction than good. Yeah. I'll just check now for any other questions here that have come up. There's lots of thank yous. Excellent presentation, Gordon, Michael, Fergal. Lots of fantastic information. Great presentations. Many thanks to all the speakers, and thank you to everyone. That was very informative. And everyone else has sent excellent information, and thank you very much. So I let you all get back to your lunch boxes and make that tea and coffee. Thank you so much, Fergal, Gordon, Michael, and as well Gary Kelly, who is there in the background, making sure all the technology, everything is running smoothly. Thank you very much, Gary Kelly of GKMEDIA. And as well, thank you very much to Marie in the Heritage Office, who has funded today's talk. So as I said, thank you all very much. Remember, we're here. I'm here. My email address is g.c.archaeology@gmail.com. And hopefully this is a conversation we'll be able to continue again into the future. Okay. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.